Listen carefully. Between Wave 22 and Wave 95 of what Iran explicitly designates as Operation True Promise 4, we witnessed a military event that fundamentally alters the global balance of power. The mainstream media desperately wants you to focus on the flashy explosions in the upper atmosphere. They want you to cheer for the intercepts, framing them as a glorious triumph of Western engineering. But when you actually analyze the raw data, when you strip away the desperate political spin, you realize the horrifying truth. Every single time one of those interceptors launched, it was not a strategic victory. It was a self-inflicted financial wound. We are talking about a systemic, meticulously calculated dismantling of a defense grid that costs you, the taxpayer, billions of dollars to maintain. The adversary did not just launch missiles into the ether. They launched an asymmetrical financial trap perfectly designed to exploit the exact vulnerabilities our defense contractors promised us did not exist. The politicians and the media pundits tell you to look up at the bright streaks of light in the sky. They tell you to feel safe under that multi-billion-dollar umbrella. But I want you to look down at the ground, directly into the epicenter of the truth, because down there the reality is entirely different. Let me take you out of the sterile briefing rooms of Washington and drop you directly onto the ground in the Middle East. When I was drafting target vulnerability assessments for the Marine Corps, we had a specific term for what happens when the sirens begin to wail across a densely populated grid like Ramat Gan or southern Tel Aviv. We called it structural paralysis, and I want you to feel the visceral reality of that paralysis because it is the only way to understand the magnitude of this failure. During those terrifying hours of Operation True Promise 4, Iran did not just lob a few token rockets over the border for a photo opportunity. They unleashed a coordinated kinetic saturation involving more than 550 ballistic missiles. But the sheer volume of that incoming fire is not what should chill your blood. It is the payload physics, and more importantly, the psychological genius behind the targeting protocol. If you are a disciplined military planner in Tehran and your goal is to cripple your adversary, you do not waste your most advanced hardware blowing up empty sand dunes or heavily fortified concrete bunkers. You go straight for the logistical jugular. You target Ben Gurion Airport, you target the economic arteries of Haifa Bay, and you do not use conventional high-explosive warheads to do it. You use the Khorramshahr 4. For those who have never studied payload mechanics, the Khorramshahr 4 is an absolute monster. It carries a 1.5-ton warhead, but it is not a solid block of explosives designed to leave one massive photogenic crater. It is a heavy cluster munition. Alongside the Khyber-class missiles, these weapons are engineered to execute a ruthless military doctrine known as area denial. Imagine looking at a radar screen inside an underground bunker. You see the primary track of the missile coming in at high altitude. Then suddenly, right before it re-enters the atmosphere, the payload fairing pops open. That one large target on your screen instantly multiplies into hundreds of smaller free-falling submunitions. It is a shotgun blast from the edge of space, raining down over urban centers and critical transit hubs. The resulting chaos on the ground is difficult to overstate. It is not just about the immediate structural damage, the raging fires, or the sweeping power outages that left entire city blocks completely in the dark. The true brilliance, the dark, calculated genius of this strike lies in the unexploded ordnance, the UXO. When thousands of submunitions are scattered across airport runways, shipping terminals, and suburban streets, you do not need to destroy a piece of infrastructure to render it entirely useless. You simply make it deadly to approach. The Israeli Defense Forces were forced into a corner, issuing urgent civil defense warnings and telling their citizens, and I quote the directive exactly, to absolutely not touch foreign objects. Think about the psychological weight of that command. Every piece of twisted metal on the sidewalk, every shadow on the tarmac at Ben Gurion suddenly becomes a potential landmine. Iran did not just pierce the physical airspace, they shattered the psychological shield of the civilian population. They proved that there is no safe haven. But how? How did a fleet of ballistic missiles manage to bypass the most densely concentrated, technologically advanced, and absurdly expensive air defense grid on the planet? To understand that, you have to look past the panic on the streets. You have to look at the cold, unforgiving laws of physics, because that is where the Iron Dome did not just fail. It was mathematically broken. To understand how a multi-billion-dollar shield crumbles, you have to stop thinking like a politician and start thinking like an engineer. Every single air defense system on Earth, from the Iron Dome to David's Sling to the Patriot batteries I used to evaluate, is fundamentally built on a single mathematical premise. It is an equation. A ground-based radar detects an incoming object. The computer calculates the object's speed, its trajectory, and its altitude. It projects exactly where that object will be in 3, 4, or 5 seconds. And then it fires an interceptor to meet the object at that precise point in three-dimensional space. It is a brilliant equation, but it relies on one absolute condition. The incoming target must have a predictable flight path. It must obey the standard aerodynamic rules of a ballistic arc. Iran looked at that equation, analyzed it for decades, and then decided they were not going to fight the interceptor. They were going to break the math. When the Khorramshahr 4 and the Khyber-class missiles enter their terminal phase, they do not just fall toward the Earth like a conventional rock. High above the atmosphere, before they even re-enter, the payload section opens. I want you to visualize this. The primary warhead strips away, and suddenly, what was one massive, predictable target traveling at hypersonic speed transforms into hundreds of individual, free-falling bomblets. This is where the physics of the Iron Dome suffer a catastrophic collapse. The brain of the Israeli defense grid relies heavily on a highly sophisticated piece of technology called the EL-M-284 radar. Under normal circumstances, tracking a barrage of standard rockets from Gaza, the EL-M-284 is a masterclass in tracking and processing. But it was never designed, and it does not possess the processing capacity to suddenly track thousands of tiny, erratic, independent targets entering the atmosphere all at once. These cluster submunitions do not have internal guidance systems. They do not have propulsion. They are literally just chunks of lethality falling through the sky, buffeted by wind, shifting their angles of descent unpredictably. How do you calculate an interception point for an object that has no fixed trajectory? You cannot. The ELM-284 radar system becomes instantly overwhelmed. The processing screens become a blinding wall of static tracks. We call this a saturation event, but in reality, it is technological blindness. The computer simply cannot process the environment fast enough to assign interceptors. Do not take my word for it. Listen to the exact quote from Uzi Rubin, the very man who is widely considered the father of Israel's missile defense program. A man who understands this architecture better than almost anyone alive. Looking at the reality of this payload separation tactic, he was forced into a bitter, undeniable admission. I want you to hear his exact words. Once the warhead opens, the battle is over. Read that again carefully. Once the warhead opens, the battle is over. There is no magical software update that fixes this. There is no patch you can download from Lockheed Martin to make a radar system track the untrackable. The defense grid was built for a different kind of war, a different kind of enemy, and a different era of physics. The Iranians knew exactly what the ELM-284 radar could see, and more importantly, they knew exactly what would cause its processing core to choke. They designed the Khorramshahr 4 not to defeat the interceptor missile, but to defeat the radar's ability to even launch the interceptor in the first place. It is a masterpiece of asymmetrical engineering. The Pentagon knew about this vulnerability. Israeli intelligence knew about it, but they ignored it because acknowledging that your flagship defense system has a fatal, unfixable blind spot is bad for political campaigns, and it is terribly bad for defense contractor stock prices. But the failure of physics is only the first half of this nightmare, because when physics fails, panicked commanders do what they always do. They try to solve the problem by throwing money at it, they override the systems, and they start firing blind. And that is exactly what the adversary was waiting for. That is when the kinetic failure stops being a military problem and becomes a direct catastrophic assault on the American economy. When physics fails, panicked commanders do what they always do. They try to solve the problem by throwing money at it. And that is exactly when the trap snaps shut. That is when a kinetic military failure transforms into a direct, catastrophic assault on the American economy. I want you to forget about the flashing lights on the radar screen for a moment, and I want you to look at the ledger, because the adversary certainly did. The strategic planners in Tehran understood something fundamental about the Western way of war. We do not know how to fight cheap. We only know how to fight expensive. And in a war of attrition, the side that burns through its bank account the fastest is the side that loses, regardless of how many tactical victories they claim on television. Let us do the brutal math together. When that cloud of submunitions, that literal rain of metal garbage, separated from the Khorramshahr 4 warheads, the Israeli defense grid panicked. To try and intercept those falling fragments, they had to fire their upper-tier effectors. We are talking about the Arrow system, and we are talking about David's sling. Do you know what an Arrow interceptor costs? It is roughly $2.5 to $3 million for one missile. A single David sling interceptor runs about $1 million, and the defense grid was firing them by the dozen, blindly launching millions of dollars into the dark to chase pieces of metal that cost a fraction of that price. But here is the detail that should genuinely infuriate you. Intelligence reports confirmed that the initial waves of this attack were not even Iran's modern arsenal. The adversary deliberately pulled old, outdated missiles from their storage bunkers, weapons manufactured all the way back between 2012 and 2014. They used 12-year-old rotting inventory as bait, and our state-of-the-art, multi-billion-dollar defense architecture took the bait hook, line, and sinker. Let us talk about the burn rate versus the production rate, because this is where the Pentagon's lies completely fall apart. The United States industrial base simply cannot manufacture these interceptors as fast as they are being fired. It takes months, sometimes years, to build the complex guidance systems for a single Arrow missile. Iran can stamp out a decoy rocket casing in a matter of days for the cost of a used car. The adversary engineered a scenario where our burn rate of critical munitions was exponential, while our production rate remained completely stagnant. They forced the United States and Israel to deplete their highly advanced, strictly finite stockpiles of surface-to-air missiles to shoot down absolute junk. This is what logistical bankruptcy looks like in real time. Now, I want you to make this personal, because it is. Where do you think the funding for those $3 million Arrow missiles comes from? It comes directly from you. Every time one of those interceptors launched from the Negev desert, that was $3 million of American wealth vaporized in the upper atmosphere. Think about what $3 million means in your hometown. That is the exact cost of repairing a crumbling, structurally deficient bridge in Ohio that you have to drive over every single morning, hoping it holds together. When they fired a volley of 10 interceptors, that was $30 million. That is an entire underfunded school district in Texas that cannot afford new textbooks or basic security. They are taking your wealth, the value of your labor, and they are literally setting it on fire in the Middle East to protect a system that is mathematically broken. And worse, they are printing the money to do it. That is why your grocery bill is double what it used to be. That is why you cannot afford a mortgage. The inflation eating away at your family's future is the direct, undeniable consequence of this exact kind of geopolitical arrogance. You are paying for the privilege of your own empire's collapse. And this financial suffocation does not stop at the edge of the desert. Because when an empire bleeds its treasury dry trying to defend an undefendable sky, the crisis inevitably spills out into the oceans, severing the arteries of global trade and forcing the men in Washington to confront a reality they have spent decades trying to ignore. When the defense grid fractures, the contagion does not stay confined to the local airspace. It spreads immediately to the water. The adversary understood that isolating a modern economy is just as lethal as bombing it. When the commercial shipping vessel MSC Ashika was explicitly targeted off the coast of Bahrain, it was not just a random act of maritime violence. It was a calculated message that sent an absolute shockwave through the global maritime insurance markets. That single strike achieved exactly what kinetic attacks on land were meant to supplement, a systemic paralyzing disruption of the supply chain. The men in Washington suddenly realized far too late that the United States could not physically or financially sustain a multi-front war of attrition against an adversary that had essentially hacked the cost-to-kill ratio. The failure in the sky was rapidly mutating into a total economic collapse of the Gulf region. This brutal reality birthed one of the most humiliating diplomatic concessions of the 21st century. Behind closed doors, away from the cable news cameras, sheer institutional panic set in. This localized panic led directly to a strict 48-hour ultimatum issued from Washington. It was a desperate, heavy-handed move, forcing their regional allies to accept a bitter, reluctant ceasefire on April 8th, 2026. But you did not hear about that ultimatum on the evening news, did you? No. Because while the global trade arteries were being choked off and while our interceptor stockpiles were scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel, the institutional propaganda machine was operating at maximum capacity to hide the bleeding. Throughout the entirety of this conflict, the Pentagon and the Israeli Defense Forces stood at their polished podiums and delivered a very specific, highly coordinated narrative to the American taxpayer. I want you to listen to the exact quote. Listen to that quote and let it burn into your memory because it is the defining lie of this entire catastrophic war. They looked directly into the cameras and told the public Iran is running out of missiles. They proudly touted satellite imagery showing American airstrikes allegedly destroying Iranian launch capabilities. They patted themselves on the back, claiming the threat was significantly degraded, completely contained, and practically neutralized. Now, I want you to hold that arrogant, manufactured statement up against the brutal physical reality of what actually happened. The enemy was supposedly degraded. They were supposedly running on empty. Yet, even under the massive weight of relentless Western bombing runs, the remnants of Iran's missile forces still possess the mathematical discipline, the logistics, and the operational inventory to pierce the most expensive defensive umbrella in human history. They were supposedly out of ammunition, yet they managed to systematically light up the night sky over Tel Aviv with cluster munitions that the radar arrays could not even process. The lie of the impenetrable air defense umbrella, the lie of the degraded adversary, and the lie of Western technological supremacy were all incinerated by basic, undeniable physics. We are watching a great power vacuum open up in real time because when the United States empties its critical finite magazines in the Middle East just to defend against cheap decoys, we are voluntarily draining the exact resources required to maintain our posture in the Pacific or Eastern Europe. Moscow and Beijing are not just watching this disaster unfold, they are taking notes. When your adversaries are taking notes on your systemic vulnerabilities, you are no longer dictating the terms of global security. You are merely surviving on borrowed time. We have now entered the abyss. And staring down into that dark reality, the United States and its regional allies are faced with two impossible strategic dilemmas. Neither of them leads to a victory. Both of them lead to a fundamental restructuring of the world order. Here is dilemma number one. You continue to fight the way you always have. You keep emptying your finite multi-billion-dollar interceptor magazines to shoot down cheap decoys over the Middle East. You appease the defense contractors. You keep the stock prices artificially inflated, and you watch as your structural logistics completely collapse. You bleed your treasury dry until the day arrives when you legitimately need those advanced missiles to defend a critical posture in the Pacific, and you look down to find your silos completely empty. Or you face dilemma number two. You accept the brutal mathematics of the situation. You impose a hard financial ceiling on interception protocols. You order your commanders to stop shooting down the decoys. But the moment you make that mathematically sound decision, you allow the enemy's payload to strike the ground. You accept the destruction of your critical infrastructure, the paralysis of your airports, and the shattering of the psychological illusion that your citizens are protected. Which poison do you drink? Do you bankrupt the empire or do you sacrifice the illusion of safety? This is the inevitable destination for a superpower that builds weapons for profit rather than purpose. We did not build a defense grid to win a war of attrition. We built a defense grid to secure endless defense contracts. The men in Washington optimized for the quarterly earnings report, while our adversaries optimized for the brutal, unforgiving laws of physics and terminal velocity. And that is why the sky over the Middle East is burning. Not because we lacked the technology, but because our institutional arrogance blinded us to the math. The shield is physically broken, the treasury is hemorrhaging, and the entire world is watching the architects of this disaster desperately try to hide the smoke. Do not look at the sky, look at the ledger, because the math always wins in the end.